sometimes it can be a little hard to wrap your brain around what exactly content analysis is or how it works. So in this video, I want to walk you through the steps involved in using this research method, 7 steps to be exact. It may seem like it's, obvious, like, oh, you just take some content and then, you just kind of analyze it. But it's obviously a lot more sophisticated than that. Remember that this is an objective and systematic research method. So there is a set of terminology involved, and there are specific steps that have to be followed in a specific manner in order to use this as a research method. So as we go through these steps, I'm going to use the hypothetical example of studying political advertising to find out just how negative or positive those ads are, because I think we all know that politics these days seems to be getting nastier and nastier all the time. So maybe you wanted to do a research study to find out whether the political ads during the 2020 presidential campaign between Joe Biden and Donald Trump whether those ads were mostly negative or were they mostly positive. So content analysis could give you an answer to that question. This would be an example of when you're looking at a topic that involves not studying people and their opinions. You're not doing a study about what people think about negative advertising. You just want to know whether the ads themselves were negative or positive. So you need to study the actual content. So just like in any other research method, before you're going to carry out a study, you need to know what it is you're trying to find out. So you need to formulate research questions and/or hypotheses. What is the purpose of your research going to be? You're not counting stuff in content analysis just for the fun of it, just for the sake of counting. There has to be some purpose, and that purpose is your research question or your hypothesis. So in the hypothetical example, let's say we pose the hypothesis that the campaign ads of Biden and Trump were more negative than positive in tone. That is the hypothesis we are going to be testing through our content analysis, and that is going to set the stage for all the rest of these steps. So then we can move on to our second step. Once we know what it is we're trying to find out, we need to gather up a sample of the content that we need in order to test our hypothesis. Now, that means you have to actually find the content. It needs to be readily accessible. The good news is that these days, so much stuff is available to us through various databases or archives that, for lots of different types of topics, it's not that hard to find the content that you need. But in other situations, it could be a big challenge. If you're doing any kind of a historical analysis where you're trying to study communication content from years or decades or centuries ago, are you actually going to be able to find that stuff? Because you need to locate the actual original content. You can't do a content analysis based on your own personal recollection of the content. You cannot do a content analysis based on what other people have said about the content. You need to find the original raw content. And if you can't find it, if it's not accessible, then you're out of luck, right? So in the case of our hypothetical, the good news is that these days political candidates generally post all of their ads, or most of them anyway, to their YouTube channels as well as to their websites. So perhaps I would study a random sample of Trump and Biden ads that were posted on their sites and their YouTube channels. Now, if there were a ton of them, which there might be, I might not be able to study all of them, so I might need to use a sampling strategy. Maybe I'm only going to examine every 5th or every 10th ad. So notice that in content analysis, rather than sampling people, as you would in the case of a survey, you are sampling texts, collecting a sample of those communication texts. Now, the next two steps kind of work together, so they kind of work in tandem. Step number 3 is about unitizing, which sometimes is a little hard to understand, but I'm going to do my best to try to explain it. So unitizing is about defining the unit of analysis, or it's also sometimes referred to as the coding unit for your content analysis. Remember, content analysis is a quantitative method. You are counting something or measuring something. What are those units that you are counting or measuring? 27 watts, 53% of what? The answer to that is your unit of analysis or coding unit, which is the unit of text that you will count in order to answer your research question or hypothesis. Now, if you were doing a study of how people use Twitter, your unit of analysis might be the tweet, where you would examine each tweet separately, and for each tweet, you would make a coding decision. Returning to our hypothetical example, defining the unit of analysis might be a little bit of a challenge because there are different possibilities here, and one of these possibilities might work better than another. And it's only kind of through trial and error that sometimes you settle upon the best unit of analysis. So in our hypothetical example of political ads, the unit of analysis might be the ad. In other words, the entire ad. I would watch an ad all the way through, and then I would put that ad into a particular category. And then I would move on to the next ad and do the same thing. So in other words, I would look at the ad, I would decide, is this a positive ad? Is this a negative ad? Is this a neutral ad? And then put it in the appropriate category. Now, the question is that the right or the most appropriate unit of analysis? Maybe, but I can see that there might be some problems with that as the unit of analysis, because there are likely to be some ads that start out negative and then turn positive, or the other way around. So which category would I put that ad in? Would I put it in the positive category or the negative category? In other words, the entire ad might be too large of a unit of analysis. I might ultimately decide that a smaller unit of analysis is going to work better and is going to lead to a higher level of intercoder reliability. So I might instead decide on the individual sentence as the unit of analysis, where as I watch the ads, I would take each individual sentence of each ad and then put it into a category: positive, negative, neutral, etc. Another possibility might be number of seconds. That might be my unit of analysis. So maybe it's a 30-second ad, and 17 seconds of it are positive and 13 seconds of it are negative. I could potentially code the ad that way. So you need to figure out what the best unit of analysis is going to be. And once you've made that decision, you got to stick to it. You can't change units of analysis halfway through the study. It has to be consistent throughout. So once you've settled on a unit of analysis, you're stuck with it. So this ties in with step number 4, and step number 4 is about constructing categories, because each one of those units of text will need to be placed into a category. And whatever your categories are needs to be determined based on your research topic and your research questions or hypotheses. Constructing these categories is actually a lot like coming up with a set of response options in a survey. Remember what we said about those response options? One of the things we said is that they have to be exhaustive. Same goes for categories in a content analysis. Your categories must be exhaustive, meaning they must cover every possibility so that every unit of text will fit into one of your categories. They also have to be mutually exclusive, which means there is no overlap between categories, so that every unit of text will fit into one and only one category. So returning to the hypothetical, what would our categories be? Well, remember, we're trying to find out whether or not the ads were mostly negative in tone. So there would have to be a negative category and then probably also a positive category. So maybe those are our two categories. We're going to watch each ad or watch each sentence of each ad, or how, each individual second of each ad, whatever our unit of analysis is. And then we're going to code it as either positive or negative. Now, the problem we could run into is that some of our units may be both positive and negative. So maybe we also need a category called both in order for our categories to be exhaustive. Or maybe there are some ads or some sentences or whatever our unit of analysis is that are neither positive nor negative. They're just basic statements of fact. So maybe we need a neutral category. See, this is where content analysis becomes a challenge, because you've got to make sure that your categories will cover every possibility, that they're exhaustive, and that there is no overlap between them, that they are mutually exclusive. Once you've settled on your unit of analysis and your categories, it's time to actually start doing some coding. Now, kind of similar to a survey, remember we said surveys need to be pre-tested. There needs to be a pilot test or a pilot study when you're doing a content analysis. And you need to bring in at least one other person, an outsider, who kind of serves as a bit of a check on your own personal biases, because you're so intimately involved in the study that you may not be able to see things in a clear and objective manner. So you need at least one other person who kind of, helps check your potential biases. So the pilot study needs to involve at least two coders. You, the researcher, count as one of those, but you need to find at least one other person. And then you need to create what we call a coding guide, or sometimes it's referred to as a code book, even though it's generally not a book. Sometimes it's no more than a single page. But the coding guide will give the list of your categories, and it will give a description or definition for each one. And then it will also give some examples for those different categories. So in our hypothetical example, if we are coding the ads as positive or negative or neutral, our coding guide would explain what we mean by a positive ad, what we mean by a negative ad, what we mean by a neutral ad, and then give some examples of each of those. So that when we bring in the second coder understands what it is they're doing and what it is they are looking for. That's what the coding guide does. It gives them a roadmap or a set of instructions to follow. And then we also need a sheet where we record our answers. And that could be an actual sheet of paper, or it could be an Excel spreadsheet. But this is where you are going to mark your coding decisions on the coding sheet. So you and the other coder or coders each need to sit down independently, meaning you don't consult, you don't tell each other what to say or what to do. You sit down independently and you code at least 10% of the overall sample. So if you were doing a study of 100 political ads, you and your second coder, or possibly even a third coder, would need to each independently code at least 10 of those ads. Each coder sits down with at least 10% of the ads, watches each one, codes it as negative, positive, or neutral. And then you need to compare your results. Because remember, in a content analysis, you need a high level of intercoder reliability. In other words, the ads that you coded as positive, hopefully the other coder also coded as positive. The ads you coded negative, the other coder coded as negative. You want to make sure that you had a high level of agreement, or what we call intercoder reliability. Now, this gets a little bit into the weeds, and we're not going to talk about these statistics. You don't need to understand them in any depth. But Scott's pi, Cohen's kappa, and Krippendorf's alpha are just examples of 3 statistical tests that will measure intercoder reliability. And what they do is they take into account the possibility of agreement by chance. What do I mean by that? Well, let's say you have 2 categories, positive and negative. Even if you and the other coder just went down and guessed for each ad, you would probably agree 50% of the time, right? Because there are only 2 categories. It's kind of like if you take a true-false exam, you're probably going to get a score of at least 50 just by chance. So what you need to do to calculate intercoder reliability is use a statistical test that will filter out or will take into account the possibility of agreement by chance. And Scott's pi, Cohen's kappa, and Krippendorff's alpha are 3 statistics that will do that. And they will produce a value somewhere between 0 and 1. The higher the value, the better. The greater the intercoder reliability. And generally for those kinds of tests, you're looking for a value of 0.75 or greater. Now, what happens if you don't achieve a high level of intercoder reliability? Well, it probably means either that there was a problem with your unit of analysis, or there was a problem with your categories, or maybe your coding guide, your coding sheet, your coding guide or code book, maybe that was not clear enough. So it means you need to go back to the drawing board and revisit some of those decisions and try again and do some tweaking until eventually you hit an acceptable level of intercoder reliability. Once you hit that acceptable level of intercoder reliability, then you alone, as the researcher, can proceed to code all the rest of the sample, the remaining 90%. And this can be a very tedious process, especially if you have, let's say, hundreds of political ads to code. It can be very time-consuming as you watch each one by one and place it into a category. But once you have finished that tedious process, then the fun stuff begins. So returning to our hypothetical example, once you had achieved intercoder reliability with your second coder, then you, the researcher, would watch all of the remaining ads, coding each one as negative or positive or neutral. And then finally, you get to a point where you've got some results. At the end, you would tally up your numbers and run some statistical tests to answer your research questions or your hypotheses. Was your hypothesis supported, or do you have to reject your hypothesis? In the hypothetical, you would run a statistical test to see if there was a significant difference in the proportion of negative versus positive versus neutral ads. At the end of the day, you actually get results, and those results would be expressed in the form of numbers and statistical tests. So those are the 7 steps behind doing a content analysis. It all begins with research questions or hypotheses, and it ends with analyzing your data and answering those research questions or hypotheses. If you follow all of these steps to the letter, then you will have done a kick-ass content analysis.